Fashionable Nonsense, the Sokal Hoax, Postmodernism, and the Fall of Fake Theory.
So, have you ever heard of an academic prank so perfect, so audacious, that it set the entire intellectual world on fire? That's what we're talking about today. It's a story that starts with a single, very strange sounding academic paper. Just listen to that title. In 1996, a physicist named Alan Sokal wrote an article with this monster of a title. It was just packed with dense academic jargon about quantum physics and postmodern philosophy, trying to connect ideas from quantum mechanics with literary theory. And get this, it wasn't just some random blog post. It got accepted and published by Social Text, a really big deal, peer-reviewed journal, and a special issue they were doing called The Science Wars. On the surface, it looked like a serious, if dense, piece of scholarship. But here's the twist. The entire thing was a fake, a parody. It was a meticulously crafted piece of gibberish, filled with quotes from famous intellectuals that were completely misused. Sokal's goal? To see if a fancy journal would publish an article full of nonsense, just as long as it sounded good and seemed to agree with the editor's own views.
I have systematically dismantled the fallacies of postmodernism, leaving no room for its return. Alan Sokal destroys postmodernism forever.
The moment the journal hit the shelves, Sokal let the cat out of the bag. And you can imagine what happened next, right? It was an absolute firestorm. The story blew up, landing on the front page of the New York Times and sparking this massive debate between scientists and humanities scholars about what counts as serious intellectual work. So, why on earth would he do this? What was the point? Well, to answer that, Sokal teamed up with another physicist, Jean Bricmont, and they wrote a whole book about it called Fashionable Nonsense, where they laid out exactly what they were trying to critique. At the core of their argument was a set of ideas that they labeled postmodernism. Now, it's important to say this is their definition, but for them, it pointed to this deep skepticism about objective truth, a worldview where science isn't about discovering how the world actually works, but is just another story or myth, no more valid than any other. So, the point of their book wasn't some grand attack on the humanities. No, it was way more specific. They were targeting what they saw as a kind of intellectual foul play, really prominent thinkers using complicated ideas from science and math, not to make things clearer, but to sound smart and confusing, often without really getting the science themselves. The book is basically a collection of evidence, a dossier, just filled with examples that they argue prove their point. They aren't saying these thinkers are always wrong, just that when they start talking about science, things can get really weird and really nonsensical. So let's look at a couple of their star witnesses. So check this out. This is a quote from the incredibly influential psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. And he's not mincing words here. He says the structure of a neurotic person is, and he says exactly, the torus. You know, a torus, the mathematical name for a donut shape. Yeah, if your first reaction is, what on earth could that possibly mean? You are definitely not alone. It's a totally baffling statement. I mean, is it a metaphor? An analogy? Lacan seems to be stating it as a fact, making a direct link between a psychological condition and a very specific mathematical object. Okay, so to get why Sokal and Bricmont found this so frustrating, we need a 30-second math lesson. A torus comes from a field called topology. You can think of it as rubber sheet geometry. To a topologist, a coffee mug and a donut are basically the same shape, because you can squish and stretch one into the other. The point is, it's a very precise and rigorous field of math. So here's the breakdown of Sokal and Bricmont's big problem with this. They're not saying you can't use metaphors. Their issue is that Lacan states this as an exact fact, but gives zero argument for why a torus is the right shape. Why not a sphere or a cube? They argue it's just name-dropping math to sound profound without doing any of the actual logical work. All right, let's look at another one they pull out, this time from the philosopher Luce Irigaray. Here, she's taking on Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. But her critique isn't about the math. She's asking if the equation itself is sexed, because it gives a special privileged position to one particular speed, c, the speed of light. Sokal and Bricmont's reply to this is pretty blunt and comes straight from physics. They basically say that c isn't in that equation because it's privileged. It's in there because it is the one specific, unique speed that makes the whole relationship between energy and mass work. It describes reality. If you swap out c for any other speed, the equation just stops being true. So all these examples of what they call scientific abuse aren't just random nitpicks. They're building blocks for a much bigger argument, an argument that gets right to the philosophical heart of this whole debate, the nature of truth itself. They call the philosophy they're arguing against cognitive relativism. It's the idea that truth isn't something we discover out there in the world, but something we create inside our own cultures. So from this point of view, Newton's laws of physics aren't objectively true. They were just accepted as true by a certain group of people for a while. There's no external reality to check our ideas against. Sokal and Brickmont, on the other hand, defend a more traditional view of science. They absolutely agree that our knowledge is never perfect and can always be revised later. That's step 3. But, and this is the key, that doesn't mean anything goes. For them, the whole game is about checking your theories against real-world evidence. That process, even if it's flawed, is what gets us closer to a real understanding of how the world works. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, this is a really interesting academic squabble, but why should anyone who isn't a professor of physics or philosophy actually care about this? Well, Sokal and Brickmont argue that the stakes are incredibly high, and not just for academics. And this is where their real motivation comes out. See, they identified as leftists. This wasn't an attack on the left. They saw it as a defense of the left. Their argument goes like this. If you want to fight for social justice or challenge powerful interests, you need to have a solid grip on reality. If all truth is relative and every story is equally valid, how can you argue that climate change is a fact or that some policies cause real harm? They drive the point home by ending their book with this killer quote from the philosopher Bertrand Russell. For them, the belief in an objective truth that exists outside of us, well, it keeps us humble. It's a check on our arrogance. The moment we decide that truth is just whatever we say it is, they argue, we open the door to a very dangerous intoxication of power. And all of this leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. This whole affair isn't just about professors fighting. It really makes you think about our own responsibilities. When we grab a concept from physics or psychology or any other field to make a point, what's our duty to the original meaning of that idea? Where's the line between a brilliant metaphor and just fashionable nonsense?